You're listening to a Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.
Welcome back to the Craftsman Online podcast. This is a weekly program focused on the relevant topics in Freemasonry and the various aspects of the craft. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, co-founder of CraftsmenOnLine.com, and he's back once again, my partner, Brother John S. Nagy. Welcome back, Coach Nagy.
Brother Michael, once again, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor and privilege.
It's always a learning experience for me every time you come on because Brother Nagy is so kind to give us his walking wealth of Masonic information. And tonight we're going to be talking about vices and superfluities. In the first degree of Freemasonry, entered apprentices were taught to divest our minds and consciousness of the vices and superfluities of life. And while those instructions may seem pretty simple, the words and work hold a much deeper meaning. And for me, I'm clear on the vices part, not so clear on the superfluities. Brother John, can you help us out?
Well, I love the fact that you just gave me a straight man statement. So I'm going to lead in with a question. You're really clear on the vices. What are those vices that you're clear on?
So I always, my definition of vices, I think of like Miami Vice, like the Vice cops, the actual things that could come into your life that would be a wedge. So I'm guessing the heavy hitters. So alcohol, drugs, gambling, impure, immoral thoughts or actions. Like to me, those are vices. If there was a vice squad, that's what they would be investigating.
Wonderful. Thank you. That is a response that I get back from a lot of brothers. As you know, I travel across the country and I go to various Grand Lodge events and what have you. And some of the times when I'm passing my time as a vendor and the outside of the Grand Lodge activities, I have brothers come by and we strike up conversations and I'll ask them, what are your definitions for vices and superfluities? And I can tell you that the vast majority of the individuals who I talk with come back with the response that you have provided here. It's the heavy hitters. And then I say, well, great. Okay. So the vices are the heavy hitters in your mind. Thank you. So I'm going to ask you, what's a superfluity and why are they grouped together? I get some unbelievably awesome conversations with some brothers. Some of them have actually taken the time to investigate and explore and very thoughtful conversations. And other times I get a blank stare and no response at all. Well, we're just supposed to divest ourselves of them. And so I say, great. And what is it we're supposed to be divesting ourselves of? Well, vices and superfluities. Yes, but what are they? And we get into a circular entanglement of going absolutely nowhere. So in answer to your question, vices and superfluities, I did my investigation early on because that was one of the first questions I asked my catechism instructor. I'm supposed to be divesting myself of these, what are they to you? And the response I got back was, well, look it up and get back with me and we'll compare notes. And it was one of the best things that I could have ever had as an instructor come my way. I was encouraged to look it up and come to my own decision and then basically justify my conclusions. And, it's one thing to go away and come to your own conclusions, but it's another thing to come back and say, here are my conclusions and here are why I have concluded what I have concluded. Just a fantastic training ground, and it laid the foundation for future studies because no matter what it is that I came up with on my own, I also trained myself to justify why I came up with what it is that I came up with. So, when I'm working with apprentices and fellow craftsmen, even master masons, when I'm asked questions, I usually put a quick statement out and say, now, what I want you to do is I want you to explore this, this, and this, and I want you to come back and tell me what you found. 9 times out of 9, not 9 times out of 10, but 9 times out of 9, every single time a brother takes that challenge on, they come back and they say, thank you so much for not giving me the answer. Thank you so much for showing me how to find the answer without providing the answer. And unfortunately, we're going to break that rule here during the interview because, well, people are coming to listen in and hear some conclusions, but I'll temper everything that I say with, don't take my word for it. These are my conclusions and I can back them up. But you come up with your own exploration and you come up with your own conclusions and make sure that you can back them up when you do. So, in answer to your first question, let's run the question by because we've gone through a lot of territory. What is the question that's put forth?
What are vices and superfluities?
Vices and superfluities are things that weigh us down, burden us. It is analogous to having put a 500-pound weight set in your back seat and hoping that you get great gas mileage. They are things that burden us, and not only burden us, but in one realm, they actually harm us, and they cause great harms through their burdening. And when I say harm us, I say I may very well have a vice and superfluity, and I may be acting them out, and I might not get harmed myself, but I may harm my family. I may harm my coworkers, my employees, my community. It doesn't make a difference where the harm occurs. The fact of the matter is harm does occur. So when we're looking at vices and superfluities, you might ask yourself, well, which one is harmful and which one's not? So let's go down that road. If I'm looking at a superfluity, if you look at the word superfluous, we're talking about it's something that's excessive. It's something that's unnecessary. That's that 500-pound weight set in the back seat of your car. Without that 500-pound weight set, you might have 40 miles per gallon. But with that extra 500 pounds, we're talking about maybe 3 or 4 bodies worth of weight that you're traveling along in your vehicle with that tremendously weighs down your vehicle, and your acceleration is going to be slower because you've got more weight to pull and push and carry with you. And your deceleration is going to be magnitudes longer if you go to stop your vehicle. Now, I use this analogy for vices and superfluities because the whole concept of vices is a subset of superfluities, and this surprises a lot of people. A superfluity is something that is unnecessary or excessive. It literally burdens you. Whereas a vice goes one step further. A vice is an unnecessary excess in your life that actually causes harm, whether it be to yourself or people who happen to be around you, your community, your coworkers, your employer, your employees, your spouse, your kids. When you have excesses in your life, these are things that are unnecessary, and yet you have them. And as a result of having them, you are carrying around stuff that you don't need to carry around. And this is important because as you are working through the entered apprentice degree work, not the degree itself, but the work that the degree points you toward, one of the things that it asks you to do is divest yourself, get rid of excess in your life. And there's only one way of doing that, and that is to practice virtues. And so when we're talking about using that common gavel to divest ourselves of excess, whether it be harmful or not, makes no difference. Every time that you take that common gavel metaphorically or speculatively and direct it toward a vice or a superfluity. What you have to be doing is investing virtue. And we've got 7 virtues that are spelled out in the Entered Apprentice degree, of which every single one of them comes into play as you're divesting yourself of things that burden you. And the interesting thing is, as you're getting rid of that 500-pound weight set in the back seat, what happens is you wind up having more strength, because now the gas that you have in your vehicle can be used to propel you in directions and speeds that you would never have before, because it's no longer being used as a way of moving the excess in your life as you travel through life.
I love that. And as you're talking about it, I gave the examples of what I believe, vices were to be if we were to be on a NBC crime drama show. But vices could also be described as big bad habits, and superfluities, as you said, come from superfluous, which are those little distractions. So another simple one that, maybe younger brothers will be able to relate to is a vice could be that guy, that brother who is always checking his cell phone all the time. He can never put that thing down. It's never more than 3 feet away from him. He's always, yes, he's always tuned into it. Where a superfluity is obsessing over having the latest cell phone technology, and that you have to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. And this is where your money and your efforts and your time goes. And listening to you, I'm thinking, okay, if I was actually to use that working tool, a common gavel, if you walked up and said, Michael, here's a hammer, I want you to start swinging this thing to break this distraction, this unnecessary need from your life, I'm not going to come at it like I'm trying to break off a big rock into tiny little pieces. No, it's going to be directed force would be the best way to describe it. So if I'm hearing you correctly, it's basically the idea is when we, at the end of the Entered Apprentice degree, we are invested with those things that we were divested with, mainly our clothes and some other personal effects. But the idea here is that by divesting our mind of these distractions, it allows our mind to now listen to our heart with the direction of where we need to be going in life.
You're divesting both your heart and your mind of the superfluities and vices. I like to focus very, very strongly on using the word excessive or unnecessary. And the reason why I like to focus on those 2 words is because if you take a look at even virtues, we have 7 virtues that are spelled out in the Entered Apprentice degree. Now, if I just take a look at temperance, if you practice temperance excessively and unnecessarily, what category does it go into? It becomes a vice or a superfluity, depending on whether it's harmful or not. Well, if we have fortitude and justice and all the other virtues that we're supposed to be implementing and putting into our lives to strengthen ourselves, if we practice them excessively and unnecessarily, we're now in the territory of claiming that we're being virtuous, but all we're doing is practicing either a vice or superfluity. So we've replaced one set of vices and superfluities with another. And this is the challenge. In fact, I'll get a little political here. If you take a look at what's going on with the virtue culture, we're talking about vices and superfluities. They're screaming that they're being virtuous and they're trying to practice virtuous activities, but they're doing it with no balance whatsoever. They're doing it with no temperance. They're not doing it in a balanced and non-excessive way. So as a consequence, what you have is a virtue culture that is actually really not a virtue culture. It's very much a vice-laden or superfluous-laden culture, claiming to be virtuous and being everything but.
Right. Yeah, I would say that right now, definitely extremism on all sides of every end of the spectrum, which kind of prompts me to thinking that it's almost unfair in the first degree that we're asking an entered apprentice to divest himself of vices and superfluities, because really you need the other working tools, particularly as you said, like you need to be able to measure this, you need to be able to balance this. So that sounds to me like you need the plumb, you need the square, you need the level to help weigh this out evenly.
And as you and I have already discussed in a previous interview, every single one of the working tools comes into play during the entered apprentice work. You're either working with it or you're developing it as a consequence of applying what you need to apply to get the entered apprentice work completed. You set your plumb in the very beginning. You are building your square of virtue by the work that you do using your common gavel, and you're circumscribing using the compasses, and I can go on and on and on, but every single one of the working tools comes into play at the entered apprentice level. And it's a shame that this is not pointed out by coaches, mentors, trainers, and instructors more often as the entered apprentices are focusing on this, because as you said, they all are coming into play. As you pointing out, it's a shame they don't mention it, because they really do come into play.
Right.
And the common gavel is actually what builds the square of virtue. Now, I'm going to go back to a wonderful observation that was made by Nick Adair out of Alaska. And I love the way his mind thinks. I talked with him recently. He says, John, virtue is VIR, man. And I said, well, the entire aspect of looking at the etymology of words, specifically with virtue, is that virtue is manly strength. And literally, if you look at the etymology, VIR, man. And what is the end goal of the entered apprentice work? Well, part of it is moving a youth to adulthood or manhood. And how do you get there? Well, you install manly strength or virtue. And part of an indication that a youth has come to adulthood is that the square of virtue is clearly evident in all their behavior.
Right.
They've got the virtue down pat, and it's balanced. It's not excessive. It's not unnecessary. Everything that they are practicing that is virtuous is manly strength, aka from youth to manhood. I wanted to mention Nick because although I had mentioned this early on in my work, he had a beautiful, gentle reminder recently that, that's something that I had forgotten that I had come across 10 years ago, and he's now bringing it up and pointing it out. And I'm saying, well, that's something I had forgotten.
One of our favorite little Masonic breadcrumbs here, and I will just put this at an esoteric level that really only brothers in the craft are going to understand it, but doesn't this make a whole bunch of sense why the pillar of strength is mentioned in that first degree? Because you have to be a strong person, both physically and mentally, spiritually, to be able to divest yourself of your own faults, because only a strong person can recognize where their greatest weaknesses are.
One of the porch pillars in King Solomon's temple literally means strength. And this is exactly what we're supposed to be doing at the entered apprentice level, is building strength. And the Hebrew word for that, where I'm going with that.
And then it also makes it interesting as we move to the second fellowcraft degree. You're surrounded with the other pillar, which is the pillar of beauty, which I would say people who have found the strength to extinguish their personal conflicts or arrest them or subdue them or overcome them have found that inner beauty that the rest of us seek. We wonder, why are they so calm? Why are they so joyous and happy in life? Why? Because they have found that beauty.
And they have established strength in their life, and they have come to adulthood, and they have left the things of childhood behind, which is the excessiveness that we come into life with. Oftentimes we need to learn how to temper those wonderful, wonderful animalistic urges that we have. And we're not supposed to get rid of them. We're supposed to direct them. We're supposed to corral them, cultivate them, and bring them to maturity so that they can be expressed in such a fashion as to bring reward into our lives rather than harm.
And is it fair to say this really isn't a task that is completed when you're passed to the fellowcraft degree? You're not leaving this divesting yourself of vices and superfluities behind as an entered apprentice. Really, this carries with you for the rest of your life.
As I have shared many times before, the entered apprentice degree is where we learn how to do this, and we show that we've had multiple successes on that front. And as a result of learning how to do it and have multiple successes, what happens is we wind up being able to spot vices and superfluities when they occur, and do it in such a fashion that once we identify them, we now are at choice, where we can decide to work on them when they are discovered, or say, well, not right now. I've got other things I want to work on.
Now, here's what's interesting is Freemasonry, we've talked about this quote before. It's quite famous, making good men better. And in the first degree, we spent a lot of time improving ourselves. We moved to the second degree. In the third degree, we're now looking to others and our place, with our relationships. How can we now take this principle of vices and superfluities into our everyday life when it comes to work, or just even in dealing with other brothers in the craft?
Well, as I had just mentioned, we establish an understanding of what a vice and superfluity is. That's the very first stage. And then after you've come to understand what a vice and superfluity is, how they're both excessive stuff or unnecessary stuff, and the difference between the two is that a vice is harmful to someone or something, whether it be ourselves or others. Once you are capable of identifying what a vice and superfluity actually is, the telltale, the hallmarks of what they are, you are then in a position where you can decide what you want to do about them. And so as you carry this into life, and if you lay the foundation early on, what happens is whenever you encounter something that is excessive, you can back off and say, that's interesting. Do I want to have that burden in my life anymore? And if the answer is no, well, you've already laid the foundation of understanding what it takes. And it's a matter of rolling up your sleeves and saying, okay, this is another one that I've got to work on. And fortunately, at that particular stage, you've had enough experience and background and skill development that it becomes a short putt. It doesn't mean it ain't going to be any more painful than any other vice or superfluity that you work on. But it does mean that you have developed and cultivated enough maturity, experience, and skill to be able to deal with it should you choose to. And I know brothers who have gotten rid of a lot of vices and superfluities in their life, and there's a few things that they said, no, those are my guilty pleasures. I'm going to keep those. And I understand it's not causing anybody harm. It's excessive, but I enjoy it. And that's something that I'm going to keep around because, by God, it is one of the things I enjoy playing or doing. And in all honesty, if you have your life together and you are pulling in a nice salary and you have your bills paid and you have a guilty pleasure, what's the problem?
Well, I also think where you were going with that, I was like, well, I know some of those brothers too. They just can't walk away from the craft. They're a member of everything that is in Freemasonry. Freemasonry becomes a vice or almost a superfluity for them. There is the flip side of this where, we're told, it's one of my favorite lines in ritual, that we're supposed to clear our hearts and minds of vices and superfluities so that we can be used for the builders. I can't quote it word for word because of the forum that we're in right now, but it's one of my favorite expressions, that our minds become living stones. And I love that. But back to the point of, sometimes Freemasonry can be a vice and superfluity for some brothers that get too invested with that.
I see where I have brothers who it's obviously excessive, their involvement. And also, I see the harm that it does in their personal lives. It's not my task to correct them. It's not my job to fix them. I may say, hey, at what point is it a vice for you? Or at what point is it a superfluity for you? And I know some brothers who are retired, and this is something that they utterly enjoy, and they throw their lives into it, and they're not causing any harm. It may be considered excessive from outside standpoint, but on the same token, they're retired, they enjoy it, they're playing, they're having fun, they're doing a lot of good, and they're keeping themselves utterly engaged in life by way and through their involvement of Freemasonry. Well, brother, if I'm 85, I live that long, and I've got time on my hands where I can dedicate every moment of my life to something that I enjoy doing. I don't think anybody's going to fault me.
And honestly, looking forward to that point as well. And I think most of our wives and partners are also looking to that point where we get out of the house more to be more involved with meetings and doing things. One last question on this, because I've really enjoyed our conversation about vices and superfluities. I kind of made the comment about using the gavel and not swinging it so heavy and hard and maybe more directed. How would you suggest we speculatively use this gavel to free our lives of vices and superfluities? What's something that we can take away after listening to this podcast, Coach?
Brother Michael, the first thing that I suggest to any person wanting to approach the entered apprentice work is set your plumb. Make sure that you know what standard you're going to be going by. And once you set your plumb, then take a good look at, well, what they say in the 12-step world is to take a searching and fearless moral inventory of yourself. And being somebody who has done something along those lines quite a few times, if you can define what excess is and what harmful excess is, and then start listing out what it is that you have going on in your own life as excessive, and create that list, and then say, basically, all right, if I could knock one of these off really easy, which one would that be? And what would I have to be different in order for me to have success in knocking that one thing off? Who would I have to choose to be? And as a result of who I choose to be, what would I have to do? And ask the question, and what virtues would have to be applied in order to make that stick? And that would be my advice.
There we go. This has been the CraftsmanOnLine podcast. Thanks again to my guests for coming on this week, Coach Brother John Nagy.
Thanks again for having me, Brother Michael.
New episodes of the CraftsmanOnLine podcast are available for download every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.
You've been listening to a Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.